attenzione d'attenzione, which is, of course, Corsican for Achtung, Achtung.
It's sort of a bit of a silly one, isn't it, really? Because it's kind of it's kind of two words which sound exactly the same but are slightly spelt differently.
Are you dissing Corsica?
Well, no, because someone's going to attack me with a flick knife.
What'll happen is a short man will come out and conquer Europe if you do that. You need to be careful. And of course, as our listeners all know, Corsica spent 10 months occupied by the Italians, more of which another time. That must have been a thankless task, occupying Corsica.
Yeah, it must have been tough, mustn't it? That must have been a really, really bad posting, I'd have thought. I mean,
bad gig.
What could it be? Yugoslavia with the Chetniks and all the rest of it, and Albania, or Corsica.
Yeah.
Or Western Desert, or Russia.
There aren't any good gigs in any of this. Anyway, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. I'm fresh returned from a trip to Germany, where I'm delighted to report to James and to our listeners, overhearing a local actually use the term Achtung with no sense of irony or arched eyebrows. Quite magnificent.
I still find it funny when people say Jawohl as well.
Well, yes, and the fact that everything is verboten in German. Parking, verboten. Forbidden. not no parking or please don't park here. Parking, verboten. It's a generational thing that kind of, all that German language is a thing we've been doused in, unfortunately.
Yes, anyway,
true. But I took my my middle daughter. I took the teen with me, and we did a bit of history. And I sent her before we left. I sent her the Wikipedia article about Operation Gomorrah.
Right.
And I said, "Have you read it yet?" She said, "No, of course not." So on the plane, I said, "Have you read it?" And then she went pale. 40,000 people, God blimey. She said, we're always taught history, and they're taught not GCSE Nazis, aren't they? And it stops in 1939. She had no idea that any of that had happened.
I don't understand that, because I know even at primary school that you get taught about the kind of home front and being an evacuee and all the rest of it. But then just as it's all getting to the really interesting bit, they stop.
Yeah, for some reason they stop at the RAF plastering a city with.
But they don't even get onto Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain.
No. Speaking of which, I'm enjoying reading your audiobook.
Yes, thank you very much. Next year you might have finished it.
Yeah, it's quite long, James.
It is quite long. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, but I felt there was a lot to say.
Well, the Battle of Britain has started. That's the main thing.
On page 478.
Yeah, exactly.
But the whole point of the book is to kind of underline that the Battle of Britain really starts in May that is when Britain is imperiled, is in May. And I think you need the context behind that. And you need to understand why it was that the Germans were suddenly kind of having a romp through France and the Low Countries.
Anyway, reading the Battle of Britain in all good bookshops imminently, I was struck by it because the other week we were talking about Sicily, and you were saying a lot of the criticism about Sicily is that they kept redrawing the plan and they didn't draft the plan straight away, and your argument is, well, doesn't that indicate that they're being thorough, right? Val Gelb goes through so many drafts and is in fact the product of.
That's a very good point.
Supposedly the greatest. I mean, without a doubt, the greatest. Successful strategic gamble of all time. I think you can safely call the conquest of France in 1940 by the von Manstein plan, Guderian's execution of it, blah blah blah. But that's all of the Halder plans, von Brauchitsch, all those people thinking, well, we'll do it the old way. Well, that's not going to work. The plan getting busted by that plane crash. Blah blah blah. The drafts that plan goes through, and yet no one goes. Oh, they're hopeless, dithering Germans.
They just can't make their minds up, can they?
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, but it's the same point as the evacuation point. Everyone's giving everyone a hard time for kind of the fact that the Germans, for the most part, get away at the end of the Sicilian campaign. But most evacuations in the Second World War are really, really successful, including Operation Hannibal, I think it's called, which is 2 million Germans evacuated from East Prussia and from what had been Poland, what becomes Poland again, in 1945, with lots of ships that don't work. I mean, the point is, if you really want to evacuate people, generally speaking, you can.
Well, it kind of undermines the idea that what you don't do is withdraw when engaged with the enemy either, because it happens over and over again, and it works.
Yeah, it's true. It's just, when we study the Second World War, there are hundreds of double standards where when the Brits do it, it's them hanging off the shirt tails of the Americans or being rubbish.
Yeah.
And when the Germans do it, it's tactical genius. I can't think of
snazzy.
Yeah, it just depends on which way you're looking at it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But it doesn't cut. It cuts both ways.
Anyway, one of our producers was in Malta this week, and kept sending photos and things, and sent back this remarkable story from the Air Museum at Tarkali, the old airdrome near to Mdina, and an exhibition. This is what he said: an exhibition on Second World War airmen included the uniform of an American called Herb, or was he called Herb? You don't know if he's an American, who was one of 50 air mechanics sent to Malta to patch up damaged B-24 Liberators, which made emergency landings on Malta when they were damaged by enemy action during operations over Sicily. On one occasion, Herb and some of his fellow mechanics were sent to Sicily to patch up a B-24 that had made an emergency landing in a melon field. Following the change of a couple of engines, the B-24 was successfully flown off an 880-yard runway carved out by the men in the melon field. Wow. I mean, you know a lot about Malta, don't you, James?
Yeah, it's a great place. It's so much fun to go. I mean, obviously, try not to be rude to the government, because that tends not to end well. But but it's a lovely place to visit. It really, really is. It's been transformed in the last sort of 15, 20 years with all that EU dosh they've been given. But it is amazing, and there are still kind of relics of the battle and stuff, and there's lots to see and do, and it's great. I mean, I do remember my kind of first ever visit there was to Cali. I got there in the morning and turned up, and there was Ray and Frederick Galea and the people that run it, and Mary Rose. They're brilliant people. They're kind of super dedicated to running this Malta Aviation Museum, and I had read this. I'd just done my first bit of research on the Siege of Malta at the Imperial War Museum, and I found this letter, and it was in this series of papers belonging to a former matron of Imtafa Hospital, which is, so from Takali you look up and there's the silent city of Medina, and then there's a sort of a gap, and then there's another hill, and on the other hill there's this clock tower, which is the old kind of British military hospital of Imtafa. And this lady had been the sister, the senior matron there. And obviously what happened is some pilot had been killed, and she'd written to the mother, and the mother had then written back. And the letter that the mother had written back, I can remember absolutely verbatim, she said, the last bit was, one day when this cruel war is over, I'm going to visit Malta and see where my boy is buried. And it was just completely heartbreaking, because for all the reasons, And I remember the hairs on the back of my neck just sort of standing up. And anyway, literally the following week, I did my first visit to Malta, and I got there in the evening, and I looked out over. I went into Valletta, and I looked out from the upper Barraccas, and I looked over Grand Harbour, and it was amazing because it looked just like it did in the black and white photographs of the Second World War. I could identify absolutely everything. And the following day, I took myself off to the Takali Aviation Museum, Malta Aviation Museum. Went to see, and I saw Ray Polidano, and I was telling him this story, and he said, "Oh, come with me," and he showed me this bits of old Hurricane and bits of old fuselage and canvas that had been around the fuselage, and he said, "That is Alex Mackey's Hurricane," and that was the boy.
Wow.
That was the boy who killed out of 750 people that came down on Malta in the war. That was one that they just happened to have. And I said, "You are kidding me." And he said, "No, it gets better," because he said Alex Mackey crash site is actually one of the few crash sites where you can still see. So we piled into a car, disappeared off, went down into this beautiful, beautiful sort of market garden valley of vegetables and tomatoes and probably melons. And there on the far side of the valley was this wall, this really high wall. It must have been kind of sort of 12, 14 foot high wall. But the top left-hand chunk of it was missing, and they said that is where Alex Mackey's Hurricane crashed. And what had happened is that he was on the night flight. He was on the 1435 night flight, and it was late January 1942, and he was taking off in the afternoon for an air test, and suddenly 3 109s came in under the radar, and just as he was taking off, hammered him. So he took off and then curled back into this valley and was trying to clear the end of the valley and get over the Dingley cliffs and bail out, and just couldn't quite make it. And he was flung out of the cockpit about 25 metres, and was obviously in a pretty bad shape. And across the other side of the valley was this tiny little church. And some people saw it happen, and came over with a ladder and picked him up and put him on the ladder. So his Sutton harness and everything had just been completely broken. And he was still alive. And they managed to get an ambulance down and took him to Imtafa Hospital, where he died 4 days later. And then prompted the letter and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
But it was this amazing moment, because I kind of just felt in a sort of quasi-spiritual way that it was kind of somehow meant to be, that I was supposed to be writing this book and researching it and all the rest of it. It was my first bit of history, and it was this incredibly touching and profoundly upsetting story about one person. And I think the thing about the Second World War is that you're always being... you can talk about the macro, can't you? And you can talk about the whys and wherefores and the value of evacuations or not, or multiple plans or whatever. But it is still being fought by millions of people who are all individuals, who have mummies who love them and all the rest of it, and are putting their neck on the line. And that really just kind of sort of brought it home to me. It's amazing. And I went to visit his grave, actually. You can see his grave and everything.
And do we know if his mother made it to Malta?
I don't, but out of the blue at the Chalk Valley History Festival a couple of years ago, this girl came up to me and said, "Oh yeah, no, I'm Alex Mackey's great niece." I went, "No, I can't believe it." It's absolutely amazing.
That is incredible.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. And there's also there's another really cool thing in Malta that you can go and find, which Ray showed me. So there's this field. And there's just this completely bare field, and it's really it's not particularly notable in any way whatsoever. Tiny little field. You go down this little track, and suddenly you can see 2 bits of iron sticking up out of the ground, and they're exactly 8 feet apart, and they just look like metal rods sticking out of the ground. What they actually are is the remains of 2 20mm cannons from a Spitfire. The Spitfire just went straight in. And the only bit that was left are these 2 cannons that just went plunged straight into the ground.
Wow.
And the cannons on a Spitfire Mark V are spaced exactly 8 feet apart. And there they still are. It's absolutely amazing.
Incredible.
Yeah, the guy bailed out, I'm glad to say. And it just literally just nosed straight into the ground. And there they still are.
And he at least had a Spitfire. Because, I mean,
Yes.
We were talking about, you were saying in it, all these macro decisions and everything, and then the individuals. They're Alex Mackey, he's on the receiving end of a decision to use basically obsolete fighter planes in Malta, because Malta's not prioritised the way fighter sweeps in 1942 are in the Channel, for instance, those rhubarbs and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But also, interestingly, the Germans are still building 109s, even though by it's a moment where basically the Hurricane's obsolete. The ME 109 is about to become obsolete.
Yep.
And the poor sod is caught in those big decisions are affecting him personally. So you're absolutely right. You can talk about the macro and go. And the individual, but
there is a single
fate. His fate's decided somewhere else by someone else. Probably.
Yeah, there is a single group of fighter group 77, JG 77, that is put on Malta between, I think, March and April 1941, something like that. And it is it's commanded by Joachim Muncheberg, who's one of the kind of great fighter aces. Yeah. And in their 3-week stint there, they destroy 42 Hurricanes for no loss to themselves.
Dear God.
Yeah. And as you know, I'm a big fan of the British war effort, and I think we by and large did it pretty well. But the lack of Spitfires being sent to Malta is an absolute disgrace. It is just terrible. And they should have been sent there absolutely from the beginning part of 1941. And what is really interesting is that Air Vice Marshal Hugh Pew Lloyd, who is the Air Officer commanding on Malta at that period, never once says, "Can you send me Spitfires?" He just says, "Send me more fighters." He never, ever specifies it. And Tom Neal and co, who were kind of over there fighting and battling in these kind of clapped-out old Hurricanes, and the big problem about the Hurricane is the one thing you absolutely need on Malta is speed of climb. because it's 60 miles to the southern coast of Sicily. So it is kind of 15, 20 minutes flying time for a 109 to come from Sicily to Malta.
Yeah.
So what you obviously want to do is have height and the sun behind you and all the rest of it. So you need a plane that can get higher than a 109 is going to be by the time it gets to Malta. And the Hurricane ain't it.
Is not that aircraft.
That is not what it can do. The one plane that can do that is the Spitfire. A Spitfire Mark II can do it better than, I mean, you should have been sending Mark IIs. They absolutely should have been sending over Mark Vs absolutely the moment they come. And what's really interesting is between November 1940 and December 1941, there are something like 11,800 Spitfires built and 9,600 Hurricanes. So in other words, there's more, and if they'd just got rid of a couple of thousand, 500 Spitfires, which they could easily have spared and sent them to Malta, that would have just transformed the whole thing. But they just don't do it. They don't do it. They do not do it.
Well, but they're also regarded as essential to Great Britain's air defence, aren't they?
But there's no threat at that point.
Yeah, but I think I know, but you could trying to think about their thinking. Is they're thinking, well, if the Germans do another concerted effort like the Battle of Britain again, we need to be. Yeah,
but they know enough about. They've got a big enough intelligence picture to know that's not going to happen. And certainly after middle of May 1941, where after Operation Barbarossa, where clearly that's not going to happen. By the second half of 1941, it's just there's no excuse for it whatsoever. And what's really interesting is that Hugh Pew Lloyd just doesn't get it. He's a bomberman by background. He doesn't understand the need to urgently require Spitfires. He just says fighters. It takes Basil Embry, who is a special envoy of TEDA, who's become AOC Middle East, RAF Middle East. And TEDA goes, what the hell is going on in Malta? Right, you mate, you're going to go over to Malta and you're going to do a thorough chat, a thorough report, check everything out and come back to me with your recommendations. Embry comes back 10 days later and goes, okay, this is what they need. They need Spitfires over there really super quickly, and they need an absolute first-class ground controller, and they just need to sort out, you need more radar, more ground control, and you need more Spitfires, and you need them absolutely as quickly as you possibly can get them. And within a matter of 2 weeks, the first Spitfires arrive.
So when they needed to, they could do it.
Well, TEDA's only comparatively new to coming to the Middle East, and he's, but it should have been Hugh Pew Lloyd flagging it up much earlier and going, this is what we need. And I remember Tom Neal said, so this is absolutely disgraceful. These Hurricanes are completely clapped out. The engines don't work. I've crashed 3 times in an island full of stone walls. I'm lucky to be alive. Please, can we get some Spitfires? And Hugh Pew Lloyd just turned to him and said, a bad workman blames his tools. And he said, that is the closest I ever got to punching a senior officer in the face.
Fantastic. Well, time for a short break. When we return, we're going to try to answer this fascinating question from Dave at Home, which recently arrived on the Twitter hashtag #WeHaveWays. Love the podcast, winking emoji. I've always wondered what happened when thousands of Italian troops were captured in North Africa. How do you feed, guard, question them all? And how do they end up in England when shipping was at a premium? Yep. James, you have a ponder while I put the kettle on. Welcome back to We Have Ways. Hugh Pew Lloyd, your name shall live forever in infamy. He's a bomber guy. You don't give a bomber guy a fighter guy job. It's as simple as that.
Simple as that. Well, I think one of the things I think is that I think to start off with in Malta, because Malta wasn't top priority, I think the kind of command there was sort of a bit B-list.
Yeah.
And it took them a while to realise that actually this is a place of enormous strategic importance. The entire Mediterranean campaign in North Africa and all the rest of it has a massive part to play, and actually we need to kind of up our game. So by the summer of 1942, you've got Keith Park there, and you don't really get any better than him.
No.
You've got Gort, who is former CIGS and head of the BEF, VC, and all the rest of it. It's just they've cranked it up, but Hugh Pew Lloyd he's just a bit B-list at that point.
But isn't that partly because the Mediterranean is the Navy's concern? Thank you very much, James, and we'll take care of this.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that.
We've knocked out the Italian Navy at Taranto, thank you, and no need for us to bother, chaps.
I think there's a little bit of that going on. Yeah, definitely. Yeah,
fiefdoms and inter-service rivalry, and necessarily at the start of the war, things aren't joined up properly, and the different bits of it. That they aren't talking to each other, and because I mean, France, the RAF, and the army basically don't speak to each other at all, and so on, and that even in those pennies are still yet to drop in 1941.
Absolutely, because I literally this morning I was just reading a quote from General Alexander in early July 1943, and he's saying, modern warfare is a correlation between air, land, and sea. The Navy, the Air Force, and the Army have to be a brotherhood.
Yeah.
It's just that's just not
you what?
Yeah, that's not part of the lingo in 1939.
No. Right, okay, so those captured Italian troops, what happened to them, James? Because after all, at the end of the war, there's hundreds of thousands of Italian men working on farms here in the UK. And a big part of the British agricultural effort at the end of the war is prisoners of war. No two ways about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, when you got Operation Compass, which is when the Western Desert Fort launches this attack across the Western Desert in December 1940, and they managed to capture basically 2 Italian armies, and they have something like 133,000 Italians they've suddenly got to deal with.
Yeah.
To start off with, they're just corralled in the kind of open desert, and then they build these cages, and then send them back to the Canal Zone, where they're put in these huge POW camps, and they're basically just shipped out. They're put on ships in the canal at Geneva or wherever it may be, and they're sent round to Britain and to Canada, and that's where they go. I mean, it's interesting, because a lot of people, when they first arrive, a lot of troops first arrive in the Middle East. The first job they're given is kind of guard duty on prisoners. And I remember talking to this amazing guy in the 28th Maori Battalion of the New Zealanders, and he was called Mikey Parkinson. And I've interviewed a few Maori, and they were all just absolutely brilliant because they all just swore like troopers. And instead of the kind of sort of, that kind of sort of British reserve, they just tell you exactly as it is. Right. And anyway, this guy Mikey turns up, he's 18, he's still got a real baby face. And all the Italian prisoners take the piss out of him. And he goes, fuck you, I'm going to fucking have you, mate. And eventually this guy just still sort of goes, little baby getting a bit cross, bambino, and all this kind of stuff. So he stabbed this Italian up the arse with a bayonet.
You're kidding?
He said, yeah, can I tell you after that, I didn't fucking take the piss. But yeah, You're absolutely right. And actually here where I am in Broadchalk, in the Chalk Valley, I was talking to the amazing guy, Alan Chalk, who first joined the farm in where I'm sitting right now in 1944 and only retired a couple of years ago. He's now, whatever he is, 89 or something. And he used to really, really like all the Italian POWs. But there was also a former Waffen SS guy who was here who made his life a misery and used to chase him and kind of make monster faces at him and all the rest of it. And, he really didn't like him at all. But he said all the Italians were absolutely lovely and they were brilliant workers. And, we trusted them.
Because that's one of the interesting things, isn't it? It's the Italians sort of became part of the furniture, didn't they? And people did trust them and accept them. And where my parents live in Buckinghamshire, the next village along, there's what was a camp for Italian workers outside the village who worked on the farm there. I mean, at the very end of the war, when the German, or after the war, when it looked like the German harvest was going to fail, German prisoners of war were sent back to work on farms in Germany by the British government as part of the sort of stopgap to try and stop the German population from starving. Because after all, German agriculture had been peopled with slave labourers from all over Europe, mainly Poles from all over Europe. And then, of course, those people all become DPs and want to go home. And the German agricultural sector looks like it's going to collapse. So they end up sending people back from here as a stopgap to try and stop that from happening. I mean, the contrast, of course, is with Germany, where basically Germany, it's a third of the armaments industry is foreign and slave labour.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it?
It's absolutely amazing, the sheer scale of it. Yeah. And concentration camps used as sort of reservoirs of labour to top up factories when they run out of people or when they're overstretched. And the irony, of course, is that Nazi Germany is more multicultural than probably modern Germany.
Yeah.
And yet it's this racist multiculturalism. It's the strangest sort of.
It's also completely self-defeating, of course, because
because
Germany's already really, really short of food. But obviously, and rationing is incredibly stringent in Germany. But of course, you can't give a slave labourer more food than a German citizen. That would just be wrong. So German citizens are already struggling and really short of food and really hungry. But your slave labourer is even worse. So, of course, as a result of that, your productivity goes down and down and down and down and down.
But then you get those schemes like where if you work well, you get more food. And then that food is taken from the guy who's working badly. So your workforce gets locked in this spiral of starvation and the wrong way round.
It's not very clever. And again, it's kind of, you just want to bang your head against the wall and just go, just give up. You're going to lose. It's not going to work.
Yeah. Which is clear by 1943. I mean, that was the interesting thing. I was in Hamburg, we talked about this earlier, in Hamburg, and I was reading Adam Tooze's book, Wages of Destruction. Yeah. And he basically makes the point that the Hamburg Raid, late July 23rd, 25th, when it was in 1943, basically marks the point at which Germany has been defeated comprehensively. It's Stalingrad's gone. The Kursk offensive has failed, and after all, the Kursk offensive is as an attempt to nip off a salient. It's not an attempt to encircle an army or drive to Moscow or take the oil in the Caucasus. Yep. Its ambition is incredibly limited. Sicily, these things all happen.
Mussolini's just been deposed 2 days before
Mussolini's,
the first attack.
So things are really unravelling. Tunisia has happened. 290,000 German Italian soldiers fall into the hands of the Allies. More even than at Stalingrad. The Luftwaffe has taken this massive kicking that we talked about quite recently, and he basically, and then you get the Speer armaments drive at the same time, which is basically a public relations exercise, because there is no war. There is no war to win. There's no way you can win the war. You can make as many Messerschmitt, you can make as many Me-109Gs as you like. They're obsolete, and you're doing it for headlines.
And they've no longer got any ball bearings, so they're using, so they're inefficient, and the synthetic oils that they're putting in are not good enough. So engines are catching fire, which is why Hans-Joachim Marseille comes a cropper, because his engine catches fire and he has to bail out, hits the tail, kills himself.
And by February of 44, the rate of attrition of Luftwaffe fighter pilots is basically 50%. I mean, but the point, and Hamburg shows, if they get the area bombing right, then of course the RAF makes the terrible error of distracting itself and trying to bomb Berlin out.
Actually, while we're on this, I mean, it was just interesting because I was just telling you that I've just read Max Hastings' books on Chastised, and it's kind of quite odd, kind of reading a book on a subject, a narrative history that I've already written about. But also, I mean, but he had lots of stuff in there that I didn't know and I hadn't put in my book, which was really, really interesting, I've got to say. But one of the points which I did think was interesting was you saying, and I've been thinking about it ever since, why was it that Harris then moved to Berlin? Why didn't he just keep hammering the Ruhr?
Well, that's the same question Tooze asks, because he says you look at Hamburg and what's happened in the Ruhr and the disruption in the Ruhr. Speer keeps having to go there and sort of do these sort of personal bravery things for PR purposes, like searching through rubble and all that sort of stuff, because they know that the Ruhr is really in trouble, and then they the Hamburg Firestorm and Chastised. It's basically the RAF Bomber Command in 43. They can do these massive efforts. They're coordinating with the 8th Air Force. It's sort of all there. And then, but Berlin's about politics, though, isn't it? That's about some sort of decapitation effort, isn't it?
I think so. But I mean, let's just say you're in Harris's shoes, and you've basically destroyed Hamburg, which is Germany's second city and its kind of biggest port. So that's a from your point of view, that's a big tick. You have hammered. Okay, so photographs afterwards of Dortmund and Essen. Suggest that the damage is greater than perhaps is the reality. But let's not get away from the fact these places are still absolutely hammered. In the spring and early summer of 1943. I mean, the Ruhr looks wrecked, and it's not like he's not continuing to hammer them. I mean, the bomber command is still being sent over to the Ruhr. It's just not.
Yeah.
It's
but
just the main
concentration.
So
Berlin.
if you're Harris and you think you've just secured, you've hammered the Ruhr, you've already got Hamburg. Isn't the kind of obvious thing to do to then go to Berlin, which is the centre of government and the centre of the whole thing, and an effort to try and do it? I mean, it's easy to be kind of wise after the event, isn't it?
I don't know, because the Americans are still interested in synthetic oil, ball bearings. And it actually, it's the point Adam Tooze makes, is if you disrupt steel production, you disrupt everything. Yes. And that everything is about steel, because after all, all the internal arguments in Germany about who gets how much steel, and of course everyone talks about tanks and planes and U-boats, but ammunition is of course the thing in actually the important thing. The fourth thing is you can build as many tanks, planes, and U-boats, but they haven't got anything to fire. They're essentially. Well,
I would agree that the all-out effort on Berlin is a mistake because it doesn't achieve what they want it to achieve.
But you can see why they made it. Yeah.
But I think you can see why you make the decision in the first place. Certainly.
Yeah.
And you have to also. I think we said this the other day. I mean, there was such a big difference between bombing actually in 1943 and there is in bombing actually in kind of by the spring of 1944. That 12-month period between the launch of the all-out strategic air offensive against Germany, which starts on I think the 6th of March against Essen actually, 1943 to the 6th of March 1944. The difference is absolutely enormous because by the spring of 1944 you really have got H2S in place. And in the case of the Americans, H2X, you really have got oboe working. You've been perfecting your Pathfinder force. You've just taken it on a whole notch.
Yes, and the 8th Air Force is enormous, but it's
suddenly overtaken
1,000 bomber raids. Because in 43,
overtaken bomber command,
Well, exactly. To do 1,000 bomber raid in bomber command in 43, they're pulling in coastal command planes, they're pulling in Wellingtons from training units and everything, just to make up the numbers for political propaganda reasons. Yeah. By 1940, the autumn of 1944, they can just do that. They can just chuck these things up. And they're flying daylight
the 1,000 bomber raids are in there. I mean, the first one is at the end of May 1942, and then they're kind of one of the big problems that Harris faces is that because of the arrival of the Americans, they've got heavy bombers. Yeah. They need all-weather airfields with concrete runways. Yeah. So a lot of the concrete runways that were being built for bomber command because of their increased emphasis on 4-engine heavies, they're having to then hand over to the Americans, and they're having to build some more. I mean, they built something like 190 all-weather airfields in 2 years or something. Yeah. I mean, it's just absolutely astonishing the level of kind of sort of construction work to fuel this air effort. And we've talked about it before, haven't you? But I mean, you cannot deny that the strategic air campaign massively cripples Germany. It really does. Well, but could it have done more? That's the thing.
Could it have done more? But without it, you look at if you're not interfering with steel and synthetic oil, the Germans have got they've got a chance of prolonging the war for another year. I mean, this is the thing: is that you're still talking about a situation where they lose. It's just a question of when, isn't it? Really?
Yeah. I guess it is.
Anyway, well, we were gonna read some questions out, but we're out of time.
We've done our usual thing, haven't we? I've just got to do a little puff actually because I'm I'm up for some award. The Military History Matters Award. Yeah. You can go online to Military History Matters and you go Awards 2020 and there's a list of about 12 different books and you've got to vote for them. And if anyone feels like they want to be nice to me. And helpful, then it would be wonderful if they could vote for Normandy 44.
Military History Matters.
Military History Matters Book Awards 2020.
Do they mean that it matters, or that it matters of military history?
I don't know.
They're having it both ways there, I think.
Yeah, I know. I don't want anyone to feel under any obligation whatsoever. I mean, you may feel that Normandy 44 was rubbish and you don't feel it's worthy of a vote. But if you do, I would be very, very chuffed.
Fabulous. Well, thanks very much for listening, everyone. Got a treat for you in store on Thursday. Daniel Todman is joining us, and he'll be discussing his brilliant new book, Britain's War Volume 2.
Yeah, we're big fans.
We're big fans. Don't miss that. Send your questions and comments and corrections by Twitter using the hashtag WeHaveWays. And do follow us on Twitter at WeHaveWaysPod. That's right. We finally gave the podcast its own Twitter account.
Yeah, that's
rather than... I mean, it's made the whole business of cutting and pasting the link that little bit smoother for me. Our email address, if you're old, our email address is wehavewastepodcast@gmail.com. It's not reserved solely for the old, despite my previous comments. It says here on this script. Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüssi, tschüss.
Yeah, cheerio.